The Solovetsky Islands are mentioned quite often by Solzhenitsyn. The Solovki prison camp is what he's referring to. He calls it the mother of the Gulag. These islands are on the northeast of Russia on the White Sea, and for centuries they were home to a monastery. This was a place of religion, a place of learning. For hundreds of years, this monastery grew to have more influence. Eventually, a prison was built there, not under the Soviets, but under the Tsars. Of course, under the Soviets, the prison greatly expanded. It had a lot of prisoners during the time of Lenin and the early years of Stalin. Because these islands were remote, it's cold there, it's surrounded by water, good place for a prison, right? A lot of the people in prison there in the 20s and 30s were Christian, and a very common criminal charge for them was economic sabotage, also known as wrecking. Now, what that was, they alleged that you are lazy or you work too slow at your day job. So if you're accused of that, the court says to you, really, your intention the whole time was to cause economic damage to the Soviet Union. That's anti-revolutionary, and all of a sudden you're a political prisoner. The punchable face that you see on screen is Nikolai Krylenko. At the time of the Russian Revolution, he was a young Bolshevik with a law degree that put him at the right place at the right time to have a big influence on Soviet criminal code. Just to give you an idea, some of the things he came up with: 1. Political considerations should guide application of punishment more than guilt or criminality. Here's another fun one: even confessions made under torture are proof of guilt. Also, there was one trial shortly after Vladimir Lenin outlawed execution. He sentenced a man to be shot. Well, of course, everyone around was a little confused. He replied, quote, "What are you worried about? Executions have been abolished, but this man is not being executed. He is being shot." End quote. You'll be happy to know he did get his just desserts. He fell out of favor with Stalin. He got purged. In 1938, he was given a 20-minute-long show trial under his own legal code. He was found guilty, taken out behind the building, and shot in the back of the head. Have you ever wondered why chess is so popular in Russia? Well, that happened in the 20s and 30s, and our friend here, Nikolai Krylenko, was one of the minds behind making it so popular. The Soviets under Lenin and Stalin wanted to be competitive in international sports. They wanted to demonstrate Soviet greatness, in particular Soviet intellect, on the international stage. And what better way to flex your brain power than to be the best at chess? Krylenko did play chess in his free time. He was also a mountain climber. He was involved in the state effort to popularize chess. There was another reason why chess as well, as opposed to any other sport. Krylenko thought that the logical nature of chess was a way to demonstrate the superiority of atheism as opposed to religion. And Krylenko hated religion quite a bit. In fact, he was known for literally foaming at the mouth in the middle of court, as he went on tirades about how much he hated Christianity, Islam, any religion. Speaking of the Soviet Union arresting Christians, the Tolstoyans were a special breed. They were a group of people who modeled their beliefs after the famous Russian author Tolstoy of the 19th century. Some of their beliefs, they rejected the organized church, including the Orthodox Church that traditionally dominated Russia. They were pacifists, even going as far as being vegetarians. Do not fight evil with evil, but return evil with good. They focused more on the teachings of Jesus and the Sermon on the Mount than they did on religious ritualism, including living a simple life and avoiding excess wealth and worldly possessions. Well, you can guess how much Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin appreciated these people's beliefs. They were arrested in large numbers. And you can guess how much lenience our old friend Krylenko, chief prosecutor, was likely to have on these people. Who were the Vlasov men? Well, the guy you see on the screen is Andrei Vlasov. He was a Russian general during World War II, captured during the siege of Leningrad. Rather than being killed or kept in prison, he defected to the Third Reich, and the Nazis put him in command of the Russian Liberation Army. These were a group of Russians fighting for Hitler on the Eastern Front during World War II, fighting against communism. Mostly they were recruited from prisoners of war and from Russian expats. Hitler did something similar with American prisoners of war as well, assembled an American fighting unit fighting for Hitler on the Eastern Front. He did not have them fighting Americans. The Nazis also had fighting units of Cossacks from the Cossack Mountains. The Nazis also had fighting units of Arab Muslims fighting for them. But after the war, pretty much all the Vlasov men were put in Stalin's gulags. The Kolyma gets a lot of mention in Chapter 2 of Solzhenitsyn's book, so what exactly is it? Well, it's not a single prison, it is a region of Russia in the far, far east, almost all the way to Alaska. The Soviet government wanted to push economic development, and what they needed was cold, hard cash backed by precious metal, and in the early 1930s, in this far, far east region, they found gold. Do you remember the gold wave of arrests? That is how much Stalin needed gold, and this place had gold, tin, silver. Hundreds of thousands, probably millions of prisoners got shipped out here. They were working on highways and also a series of mining camps. They send people to prison, they send them out east, and they mine gold for the government. All of a sudden, this whole prison complex becomes industrial and needs to be fed with new bodies. The highway they built at the time was known as the Kolyma Highway, but today it's known as the Road of Bones because of how many people died constructing this. Tens of thousands of deaths on a single stretch of highway for Russia's equivalent of the Transcontinental Railroad. The man you see on screen is Andrei Vyshinsky. He was born in the 1880s, so he's slightly older than your average Soviet, at least the ones who were active in the 1930s. Now, he was a Menshevik before and during the time of the Russian Revolution, which would have gotten him a fast-track ticket to Gulag if he had not had an acquaintanceship with Joseph Stalin at the time. He is of Polish descent, did 1 or 2 terms at the University of Kiev, and then settled on the legal profession in Moscow. He did a lot of legal and judicial work in the 1930s. He was a high-ranking prosecutor in the Soviet Union, frequently called political prisoners and people on trial mad dogs, was very inflammatory in his rhetoric, specifically towards Trotskyism and towards all the Western ideologies. Quite literally anything to the right of Stalin. Also, he is attributed with such a wonderful quote as, "Give me a man and I will find the crime." He was a wartime diplomat during World War II, and this is the guy who oversaw the Nuremberg trial. What you see on screen is a scale replica of the Buchirka prison in Moscow. This is where Solzhenitsyn had his interrogation. It was built in 1879, and during the imperial period, it seemed to only have slight overcrowding. During Soviet times, it had severe overcrowding. I mentioned from Solzhenitsyn, 15 people in a room meant for 1, 180 plus people in a room meant for 24. I found another account outside of Solzhenitsyn that said there were 100 people in a room meant for 10. I found in 2019 the warden of this prison gave the number 1,874 as the official capacity for this prison, but I also read that during the 1930s, often 20,000 people at a time would be housed here. Other sources say that this prison is known for being hot in summer, and in fact Solzhenitsyn writes that so many bodies crammed into one space, everyone's breath together goes to increase the heat even more. The man you see here is Nikolai Bukharin, born in 1888. He participated in the Russian Revolution. He was friends with Lenin and Trotsky, and he did a lot with Stalin's government. Had a big hand in the 1936 Soviet Constitution. He was a victim of one of Stalin's purges, and he had a very public show trial. This trial became very well known. Vyshinsky, do you remember him? He acted as the state prosecutor during this trial, gave a long speech. You could actually see the speech on YouTube. Typical of a Vyshinsky speech, talks about Trotskyism, talks about how they need to root out the enemies of socialism, and of course his signature phrase saying they need to be shot like rabid dogs. In March of 1938, that is what happened to Mr. Bukharin. The Shakti trial was one of the first big show trials in Soviet Russia. 1928, do you remember in Chapter 2 when I was talking about how the whole fad of wrecking came into vogue? Well, this trial featured 53 engineers from a town called Shakti. The prosecutor for this one was Krylenko, and the chief defendant was Peter Palchinsky. These engineers were charged with conspiring to conduct economic sabotage. Of course, they were found guilty. Did you think there was any other option? 11 of them were sentenced to death. The rest of them were given prison terms. And funny enough, if you can believe it, rather than softening the public's perception of people who were put on these show trials, the public actually had somewhat of an outcry against engineers and factory administrators after this. Even though the outcome of this trial was known from the very beginning, people who were in positions where they could potentially cause economic sabotage were put under greater scrutiny. Leon Trotsky, here's a wild one. He was a key figure in the Russian Revolution. Very close with Lenin, he negotiated the treaty that pulled Russia out of World War I, and then he served as the People's Commissar for Military Affairs from 1918 to 1925. He was influential. There's actually a school of socialism named after him, but he was too influential, too outspoken. Trotsky favored more internal party debate, and a lot of people also think he would have been less brutal with the Gulag system. This was obviously a problem for Joseph Stalin. And after Lenin's death in 1924, Big Daddy was no longer around to defend Trotsky. He was exiled, fled the country actually. 1929 was the year he left Russia. After that, he sort of became the face of treasonous opposition movements. If you've read 1984, the character Goldstein, 2 Minutes Hate, is meant to be Trotsky. Wrote a very long, multi-volume history of the Russian Revolution. Lived out his final years in Mexico before being assassinated in 1940. The Lubyanka building was built in 1898. It was originally the headquarters for an insurance company. After the revolution, they changed that. This became known as one of the biggest interrogation sites, and there was a popular joke in Moscow that this was the tallest building in the city because you could see Siberia from its basement. It did not stay part of the prison system forever, though. Interestingly, after the death of Stalin in the 1950s, they transitioned this building to be the headquarters of the KGB. Sometime during the 50s, prisoner interrogations in this building stopped. I suppose they were moved to other buildings. During the 1980s, the prison ground of the building was turned into a cafeteria for KGB staff. In 1991, of course, the KGB disbanded. At that point, this building became the headquarters for the Russian Border Guard, as well as they opened up part of it to be a KGB museum, so now the public can go in and take tours of what was once the prison. This is Le Fortevaux prison. Does that name sound French? It is. It was named after François Lefort. That's a holdover from a time when French was the language of the Russian aristocracy. Built in the imperial days, 1881, you can be sure that this prison expanded a lot after the revolution. Located in Moscow, the NKVD used this a lot for interrogations, executions, torture, prisoner housing. This place was a big part of Stalin's Great Purge. That happened between 1936 and 1938. This one notably is still a prison to this day. Wikipedia says this one has notably strict policies about visitors. No visitations except by lawyers, and all letters in and out are read by prison officials. The man you see here is Maxim Gorky, born in 1868. He was a Russian writer and socialist, influenced, of course, by Tolstoy and Chekhov, other Russian writers slightly before his time. Now, he was critical of both the Tsarist regime and the Bolshevik regime. In fact, he was exiled under both the imperial czars and the socialists for a little while. He returned to Russia at the personal invitation of Stalin, lived there several years, kept traveling, kept writing, but in 1934 he was placed under house arrest. During his time in house arrest, he was visited both by Stalin himself and by the NKVD chief, Genrikh Yagoda. He took ill during this time and eventually died. His son also took ill during this time and eventually died. It is widely believed that Yagoda, with the assistance of doctors, poisoned both of the Gorkys, both father and son. It's also speculated that Yagoda had a thing for the younger Gorky's wife. Genrikh Yagoda, a great example of one of Stalin's purge victims, rose through the ranks quickly after the revolution. It's believed he knew Stalin as early as 1918, was rumored to have had secret sympathy for some of the people arrested and put on show trials, such as Bukharin. That did not stop him from expanding the Gulag work system. Up until 1929, the Solovki prison, Solovetsky Islands, was the only prison work camp. Yagoda expanded that. He oversaw the beginning of construction on the White Sea-Baltic Canal and the Moscow-Volga Canal. Both of those were forced prison labor. In 1936, he delivered a report to Stalin saying that the international reaction to the show trials was very bad. Stalin interpreted this as a recommendation to end the show trials. That did not go over well. Yagoda was accused of Trotskyism, and in 1938 he was executed. Kresty Prison in St. Petersburg, so called because of the two cross-shaped buildings you see there. It was originally intended to hold 1,150 prisoners, primarily for solitary confinement. Built during Imperial Russia, this held a lot of political prisoners. In 1917, during the Revolution, that is, the February Revolution, the revolutionaries stormed this building to try and emulate the storming of the Bastille. They freed all the prisoners, they burned all the prison paperwork. Under Lenin, this prison held a lot of people who previously worked in the old government. The prison later expanded very much under Stalin. Do you remember that phrase, the process is the punishment? Or at least part of the punishment in the Soviets' case. They packed 15 and 20 people into cells that were meant for a single person to be under solitary confinement. Some estimates say that this prison, originally meant for 1,150 people, in the time of Stalin held over 12,000, over 10 times capacity. Soviet towns in the Arctic Circle, Vorkuta. A humble little frozen town that people just love living in. Like I said, it's just above the Arctic Circle, got its name from the nearby Vorkuta River. Started out as a mining town. Oh yeah, did I mention it started out as a forced labor camp? In the 1930s, the Soviets found coal in the region, so of course they set up a camp, they put a bunch of prisoners there, you dig dirt now. Decades later, this grew into a whole town with an economy, and one with a population decline crisis. As of 2002, the population was around 84,000. As of 2010, the population is around 70,000. I have not seen a more recent update. The figure you see before you is Sergei Kirov. He was a good little Soviet, former Menshevik, turned Bolshevik before the revolution. He was personal friends with Joseph Stalin. Did a lot of work in Soviet government, got a high-ranking position, helped consolidate some of the Eastern European states under Soviet rule, until his assassination in St. Petersburg, also known as Leningrad, in 1934. Now, tinfoil hat time. Whodunit? Well, there's the official Soviet state narrative. Leonid Nikoliev, along with several others, were accused, found guilty in a trial. The prosecutor on that one was Vyshinsky rather than Krylenko. But, well, the year is 2025. Most of the people listening to this have already gotten their feet wet with conspiracy theories. And at this point, we've all read the interrogation chapter, haven't we? Haven't we? So none of you will be surprised to hear that it is widely believed Stalin had Kirov assassinated as a false flag, so he had an excuse to do a purge. The man you see on screen is Lavrentiy Beria. Born in 1899, he was one of the longest-serving chiefs of the NKVD. His time there included the years of the Great War, where he oversaw a lot of war crimes in Poland, also expanded the Gulag labor system for wartime production, died in 1953. I will give you 3 guesses as to what happened. 1953, this guy was actually in a good position to be Stalin's successor, but if you guessed he got purged, you would be correct. He was accused of being a traitor and capitalist agent. At the trial, it also came out that this guy was a serial rapist, which, yeah, that tracks. According to his bodyguards, he would drive around Moscow in a limousine, point out whichever woman he liked, invite them into the car, give them wine, give them dinner, take them to his soundproofed office where he would do the deed. When each of them left, he would hand them a flower. If they accept the flower and take it, it means that the deed was consensual. If they refuse, Gulag. The man you see on screen is Nikolai Yezhov. This guy was NKVD chief just prior to Beria. In office from 1936 to 1938, he was known for being the one who oversaw the Great Purge of 1937. But, footnote, remember what Solzhenitsyn said in his chapter on the history of the Archipelago, 37 was neither the only nor even the biggest one, but it is one of the most well-known ones. Yezhov oversaw a lot of torture and executions, a lot of prison overcrowding. Something notable about Yezhov, he did not come out of the organs, so to speak. He was not part of state security before being appointed to this position, meaning he was just the person that Stalin needed to purge and clean out the ranks of the party. What's that? You'd like to know how his term in office ended? Oh, you don't even need to ask. In February 1940, he was executed by firing squad. These pesky anti-revolutionary elements. This is Viktor Abakumov, born in 1908. He was a little young to be in the revolution, wasn't quite that first generation of Soviets. This guy did, though, rise through the ranks of Soviet secret police. He was head of the Smersh. That is an acronym which means death to spies in Russian. The Smersh was an organization that investigated people within the Soviet army who were accused of being spies. Based on what you've read so far, you can probably guess how many of them actually were spies. So from 1943 to 1946, he was head of Smersh. From 1946 to 1951, he was Minister of State Security. How did that assignment end, you may ask? Oh yeah, he was arrested. The excuse they gave for arresting him was he failed to investigate the doctor's plot. We'll get more into that later, but 2 years later, in 1953, shortly after Stalin's death, he was given a trial and execution. This is Grigory Zinoviev. He is an old-school Bolshevik, knew Lenin before the revolution, was a Bolshevik the whole time, one of the first generation of Soviets, was elected chairman of the Petrograd Soviet, that is St. Petersburg. He was one of the people, after Stalin's death, he sided with Stalin against Trotsky, came out on the winning side in that particular exchange. However, in 1934, do you remember the Kirov assassination? Zinoviev was one of the people implicated in that. He was purged in 1936, he was given a show trial, and he was executed. When you play the game of Soviets, you either win or you die. The party member at the very, very top is usually the only high-ranking party member to die a natural death. And not even always then. More about the time of Lenin's death, Zinoviev was a big figure in the party, but a lot of people think he wasn't able to assert full control of the party on his own, which put him more in a kingmaker position. Grigory Potemkin was a Russian aristocrat born 1739, lived in the time of Catherine the Great, died 1791. Now, you may be asking, what does this have to do with Gulag Archipelago? This is 150 years before Soviet times. This man's name, in colloquial usage, is actually referenced several times in the book. Reason being, he was famous for being accused of having lied to Catherine the Great about how prosperous some of her lands were. Here's the part that made it famous. The accusations were that he had whole fake villages constructed, hundreds, perhaps thousands of paid actors, allegedly, so that when Catherine went to tour the area, tour the countryside, she would see a prosperous village, and then she'd go back home and she would be none the wiser as to any poverty in the kingdom. You can imagine how, in the time of Joseph Stalin, when he was breathing down the necks of all his subordinates, asking for example, output numbers from the collective farms, you can imagine how the term Potemkin village became relevant. What you see here is Sukanovo prison. This was a former monastery. In the time of Stalin, of course, they converted it into a prison. This was located just south of Moscow, close enough to the city to be considered a Moscow prison. Of the 4 big Moscow prisons of this time, those were Lubyanka, Lefortovo, Bucherka, and now Sukhanova. This one was considered the worst. This one, Solzhenitsyn says, was the one where the interrogators would threaten to send all the prisoners from the other prisons if they misbehaved. This prison consisted of 2 buildings. Solzhenitsyn hears about this from one of the cellmates in his first cell. And they would do the interrogations in the cells where the monks used to sleep. They would also have hot rooms and cold rooms where prisoners would sweat or freeze. Sleep deprivation in this prison was used to the point where prisoners were driven insane. In 1992, this location was converted back into a monastery. The port of Nokodka. That's a mouthful. That is a port in the far east of Russia, south of the Kolyma. It's on that little peninsula, if you look at a map, that juts out and sorta hugs China. It connects the continental mainland to the Sea of Japan. Solzhenitsyn mentions this port in reference to all the Russian expats living in Shanghai in the 1940s, the late 40s, of course. Now, apparently, if you can believe it, oh boy, never would have guessed that the Soviets had involvement in the Chinese Civil War before World War II kicked off. Never would have guessed that. Now, of course, along with that, similar to how Europe had a lot of Russian expats before World War II, well, so did the city of Shanghai. After the war wrapped up, of course, Stalin rounded up a bunch of the expats from Europe. He needed some extra time to get his greasy little fingers on Shanghai and round up the expats there. But sure enough, he did so, and a lot of those went through the port of Nokodka into the Gulag system. The man you see before you is Vladimir Mayakovsky, born in 1893. He was a Russian poet, a supporter of the Bolsheviks. He saw the Soviet Union in the 1920s. He turned his writing and playwright skills to the benefit of the Bolsheviks before and during the revolution. He came to prominence, became well known for his work after that, but you may notice he was not a perfect Soviet. He was not a fan of censorship. At times, this put him at odds with the Soviet Union, but as far as I know, he did not get arrested. Perhaps he was just too high profile and it was too early a time in Soviet history to arrest such a well-known person. Stalin, after Mayakovsky's death, gave him a lot of praise, called him the best and most talented poet of our Soviet epoch. The man you see before you is Vladimir Nabokov. He was one of those who Solzhenitsyn speaks of when he talks about the stream of Russian culture coming from the expats. Born in 1899, he grew up in St. Petersburg, Russia. During the Revolution and the First World War, his family fled to Crimea for safety. Eventually, they ended up in New England, USA. He became a professor of Russian literature at Cornell University, got his U.S. citizenship in 1945. As far as his writing goes, you may know him for the book Lolita, which was not published in America, first of all, because he was afraid of that getting censored. I wonder why. No, that book was initially published in Paris. The French, bless their hearts. As far as his politics go, he has always been a classical liberal, always been opposed to Bolshevism from the beginning, and as the Soviet government went on and got more and more repressive with time, I'm sure that opinion of his just hardened more. Unlike many 20th century Russians, this guy actually died of old age in 1977, age of 78. The 1927 amnesty of Soviet prisoners. We've heard this talked about directly in the book. I talked about it in the summary already. Big celebration for the 10th anniversary of their revolution. However, two notable things. The number of people freed was tiny compared to the number of people getting arrested at the time. And, of course, tiny compared to the number of people Stalin would later arrest. Also, as Solzhenitsyn says, the state started to get possessive of their prisoners. They were reluctant to let anyone go. Something else is interesting about the year 1927. This was 3 years after the death of Lenin. This was also the year that Trotsky was expelled from the party. Also the year that Zinoviev was expelled from the party's Central Committee. So all in all, 1927, an interesting time, was a time when Stalin solidified his control over the Soviet Communist Party. Also a time when the party narrative about anti-Trotskyism started to solidify, as well as one of the last opportunities in a long while for prisoners to see any kind of mass amnesty. It is time to talk about Rah-Rah Rasputin, lover of the Russian queen. Yes, lots of people know about Rasputin from the song. Fewer people know that Rasputin was actually around at the same time as the Russian Revolution. Apart from creating drama in the Russian royal household and among the noble families, he was an absolute PR nightmare. The last Tsar before the Russian imperial government finally fell was seen as completely out of touch, ineffective, didn't have the people's needs at heart. And this guy, Rasputin, existing anywhere near the royal family, just put a lot of fuel on the fire of the people who were calling for revolution. Like, imagine if the US president invited some crazy dude to stay at the White House for months and years on end. They never shower, they dress like vermin supreme, and they keep talking about these wacky, out-of-left-field religious ideas and pretending to be a prophet. That is what Rasputin was at the time when the people were discontent, willing to overthrow their government. The Soviet leader that might have been, the man you see here, is Yakov Sverdlov. He was a key Bolshevik, had a hand in the revolution, even worked his way up to being chairman of the All-Russian Central Executive Committee. So he was effectively head of state in 1918. This is a guy whose name might have been uttered in the same sentence as Lenin and Trotsky. This guy's name was signed to documents such as the order to execute the emperor's family, and the treaty with the Central Powers during World War I. So how did such an influential figure become a footnote in history? Why isn't this guy talked about more? Well, because he died in the year 1919 at the age of 33. Official cause of death, Spanish flu, although nobody can prove that it wasn't poison. Honestly, we just don't know for sure, and there's a chance that it actually was Spanish flu. So now we get to daydream about what Soviet law would have been like if this guy had been supreme leader instead of Lenin or Stalin. Life just happens like that sometimes. After World War II, the Soviet Union found itself in control of a lot of land in Eastern Europe that wasn't previously under their control. That includes the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. In short, their goal was to do with this new land as they did with the Russian mainland in the 1920s, arrest quote-unquote kulaks, aka anyone with more wealth than average, arrest anyone likely to oppose in any way the institution of collective farms on a large scale. So in 1949, more than 90,000 people from this region were arrested and funneled into the Gulag system. In a lot of cases, entire families all at once would be rounded up, deported. They would move them either to northern Kazakhstan, which Russia also controlled, or to Siberia. And we will certainly get into more about what those labor camps in the Gulag system were like. This is Patriarch Tikhon of Moscow and all Russia. He featured heavily in Chapter 9. Born in 1865, he took his monastic vows at the age of 26. Tikhon is actually an ecclesiastical name after Saint Tikhon of Zadonsk. He was born Vasily Ivanovich Belavin. Something that may surprise you, in 1898 he was appointed Bishop of the Aleutian Islands and Alaska. He became a naturalized U.S. citizen, spent time in New York, Chicago, also Pennsylvania and Ohio, other places in America as well. He returned to Russia in 1907. He was then elected Patriarch in 1917. Of course, then his trial in 1922 features heavily in Chapter 9. The Soviet government then sunk their greedy little hands into the Orthodox Church and deposed him in 1923. He stayed in house arrest until his death in 1925. In 1989, he was canonized a saint and confessor of the Orthodox faith. Confessor meaning he professed his faith and defended it in times of persecution and was punished for it. So there we have Saint Tikhon of Moscow. This is Nikolai Losky. Solzhenitsyn names him as N.O. Losky in Chapter 10 of his book. He is mentioned as being one of the many victims of the Soviet legal system, particularly one of the Moscow intelligentsia who was persecuted. In this case, though, he got out all right. He was actually exiled from Russia in 1922. He spent time living in Prague and New York. He was a philosopher, studied ethics and libertarianism. He was also the father of the more well-known Vladimir Lossky, who was an Eastern Orthodox theologian in Paris. Another deportee from Russia, another Moscow intellectual. This is Sergei Bulgakov, mentioned as S.N. Bulgakov in Solzhenitsyn's book, Chapter 10. He was a theologian, as you might be able to tell from the cross around his neck. He was expelled from Russia in 1922, along with many others. Born in 1871, he was in his 40s at the time of the revolution. He actually was a proponent of Marxism during his early life, but in the early 1910s he drifted away from that. He was in the priesthood at the time of the revolution and in the early 1920s leading up to his exile. This is Nikolai Berdyaev. Born in 1874 near Kiev, he is another one who got exiled in 1922. People call him a Christian existentialist who emphasized the importance of spiritual human freedom, which reminds me a little bit of the mindset of Origen of Alexandria, that particular early church father. The physical world is all dust, the state of our souls is what counts. So many Russian intellectuals being exiled did create a large diaspora that did influence wider culture. That is part of why Stalin wanted to round them all up in the late 1940s and put them back in the Gulag system. But before then, he did gain enough influence to be mentioned in the dedication of Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World. You may have heard of it. This is Semyon L. Frank. He is a Russian philosopher. Born in 1877, he is another one who got expelled from the Soviet Union. Born to a Jewish family, he converted to Orthodox Christianity, said that he considered his Christianity to be the completion of his Old Testament upbringing. Spent a lot of time in Germany, translated a lot of philosophical works. Was elected as head of the Russian Scientific Institute in Berlin between 1931 and 1933. In the late 30s in Germany, of course, his ancestry led to some problems despite him being a practicing Christian. His children ended up escaping to Britain while he and his wife hid out in the French Alps. After the war, he and his wife followed their children to Britain, where they lived out the rest of their lives. This is Ivan Alexandrovich Ilyin. He was a supporter of the old regime, the Imperial Russian regime. He saw the February Revolution as a temporary disorder and the October Revolution as a national catastrophe. Safe to say, he wasn't exactly fond of the Soviet Union. A political philosopher who was well known during his time, he's another one who ended up at that Berlin Russian Academic Institute. During the Nazi years, he is another one who rubbed up against Hitler. He did not like totalitarianism in the Nazi form much better than in the Soviet form. He was expelled from the institute, but they did allow him to keep living in Switzerland, just practically unemployable. He wrote numerous books in both the German and the Russian language about political, religious, philosophical topics. Was able to live out his life in Switzerland before dying a natural death in 1954. The man on the screen is Yuli Eichenwald. Born in 1872, he was a Russian Jewish literary critic. Did a lot of writing in his homeland of Russia before the revolution. He would have been in his 40s at the time of the revolution, so he had time to do it. Among other things, he wrote an essay that was critical of Leon Trotsky, haha, Gulag. Just kidding, in 1922 he was exiled to Germany. Continued his writing until 1928 when he died in a tram accident, and he's buried in a Russian Orthodox cemetery in Berlin. Born in 1875, this is Peter Palczynski. In the book, he is mentioned as an engineer of particular fortitude, who was tortured and killed following the Shakhty trial, but did not give in, did not sign the paper that the Soviets needed him to sign. Before that, though, he had a long life and a long career. Back under the imperial government in the early 1900s, that is the first decade of the 1900s, he did some work in the mining industry. He also lived abroad for 8 years, first in London, then in Rome. Returned to the motherland prior to the Russian Revolution. In fact, he was made deputy chair of the War Industry Department, still under the imperial government. After the February Revolution, a provisional government took over. He held several positions in that provisional government. And then the October Revolution was when the Soviets took over. Palczynski was a man of science and engineering. He rather liked the Soviets' talk of progress, which is why he continued to have an influence on Russian industry all the way until his death in 1929. This is Lev Kamenev. He is another one who might have been head of the Soviet Union in another timeline. Born in 1883, he aligned himself with Lenin's Soviet Party pretty early on, as early as 1905. went in and out of prison, in and out of exile, was actually in Siberia at the time of the February Revolution. After that, he returned to Russia proper. He sided with Lenin and the Bolsheviks during their rise to power. After Lenin's death, Kamenev, Zinoviev, Stalin, and Trotsky were some of the big players on the Soviet Union political stage. He had his first big political downfall in 1927 for being associated with Trotsky, made his way back into the party, though not at the top rungs, and then had a second big political downfall in 1934 with, wait for it, the Kirov assassination. He was sentenced to prison, although he did not get to serve out his term because he was accused of something else, got found guilty of treason. He was assassinated by firing squad in 1936. If you're looking for a reason to distrust international law, heavy influence from the same nation that brought us the Gulag system and the Shakti trial would be it. Vyshinsky being one of the prosecutors for the Nuremberg trials was bad enough, but a man named Sergei Krylov, whose photograph unfortunately I could not find, he was one of the ones who helped write the UN Charter, and he even served as a judge for the UN's International Court for a time. This guy was a good little Soviet born in 1888, graduated from the University of St. Petersburg, was involved in a lot of international diplomacy and international law on behalf of the Soviet Union, spent some time teaching international law in Moscow, had a hand in the International Court of Justice, which is still around today, and he was one of the few Soviet higher-ups who died peacefully in the year 1958. You may have heard in the book mention of a 5-year plan under Joseph Stalin starting in the year 1928. There were some arrests, exiles, and executions related to this plan, specifically of engineers. What you might not know is that despite everything you would expect from central planning and how abysmally it's likely to fail every time, parts of this 5-year plan were a success. One of Stalin's goals was to make the Soviet Union a highly industrial nation. This contrasted with the heavily agricultural economy that it had for centuries under imperial rule. Between 1928 and 1940, the number of workers working in either construction or industry nearly tripled, and I'm sure that packing the Gulag system full with millions and millions of prisoners did not hurt either. Other various economic goals they had during this time were a mixed success, and some of them were a complete failure. You'll hear Solzhenitsyn write about in that chapter some of the goals being laughably unrealistic. This is Russian naval commander Alexei Shastny. Born in 1881, he was a decorated naval officer, had experience serving in the Russo-Japanese War, had a long military career. That includes before both revolutions back in Imperial Russian times. So little wonder why his loyalty came into question when the Bolsheviks took over. Trotsky in particular did not like him. He was charged with refusing orders to negotiate with the Germans. This is World War I, mind you. He was charged with high treason and, quote, proposing a dictatorship of the Baltic Fleet, end quote. I don't know how close that actually is to the truth, but considering that in 1992, after the Soviet Union fell, the official new Russian government vindicated his name and named a street after him in his hometown, I'm gonna say that this was probably a loyal Russian officer. Nevertheless, you may remember from Solzhenitsyn's writings, this was the one who was sentenced to be shot, and Krylenko made a point to say he was not sentenced to be executed, but to be shot. The Provisional Russian government existed for 8 months between the February Revolution and the October Revolution. The long-lived Soviet government came into existence when the Bolsheviks took over in the October Revolution. The Provisional Government came into existence when Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne, voluntarily left, in the February Revolution. So this government from the beginning being a peaceful transfer of power from the Tsarist government to a new form of government, left some people dissatisfied. And that was compounded by this government not having the most efficient structure for getting things done. There was a lot of politically partisan bickering and debate, and not a lot of decisive action. This government was shaky all through its short history, did not make it even a full year, and in the end it was forcibly dissolved when the Bolsheviks did a military takeover of all government buildings. And so begins the era of Vladimir Lenin. Valentin Bulgakov was born in 1886. He met Tolstoy in 1907, close to the end of Tolstoy's life. He became Tolstoy's personal secretary and biographer. He worked on organizing and publishing a lot of Tolstoy's writings, was prominent in the Tolstoyan movement, we talked about them already, people who followed Tolstoy's teachings of Christianity, pacifists, vegetarians, etc. Valentin also had a big part in the Tolstoy Museum of Moscow. Surprisingly, the museum was not immediately done away with by the Bolsheviks. In fact, Lenin nationalized it and kept Bulgakov as its head. In 1922, however, you may guess that Bulgakov was among that wave of Moscow intelligentsia that was exiled. He spent time in Prague doing literary work until World War II broke out. The Nazis arrested him on suspicion of being a communist. After the war, he went back to Russia, surprisingly was not arrested immediately. No, in fact, he was allowed to once again be the keeper of the House Museum of Tolstoy. This one actually has a happy ending. This is Felix Dzerzhinsky, born in Russian-occupied Poland in 1881. He was a Russian revolutionary. OG participated in the 1905 failed revolution, was imprisoned by the Russian state in 1912, and later freed during the February Revolution, 1917. He then joined Lenin's Bolshevik Party, where he played an active role in the October Revolution. That December, Lenin named him head of the All-Russian Extraordinary Committee, known as the Cheka. So this guy had a big hand in cracking down on counter-revolutionary activity. He had a hand in the Red Terror, he had a hand in founding the Gulag camps. He remained with the Cheka during and after 1922 when it was reorganized into the GPU. So this guy was to the arrest system as Krylenko was to the prosecution system. Well, for better or worse, this guy died of a heart attack in 1926. After 1991 in Russia, he is remembered not too fondly. Did you know that Soviet Russia had a de jure head of state who was separate from Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin? This is Mikhail Kalinin, born in 1875. Took part in the failed 1905 revolution as well as the October Revolution. The official title was Chairman of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union. So a little about the political structure. When we say Soviet Union, it's meant to be a union of Soviets. And a Soviet can be thought of as a local governing body on behalf of the workers. So, for example, the St. Petersburg Soviet had its own meetings, had a chairperson, and that chairperson can be thought of as having some amount of influence as speaking for the workers of St. Petersburg. Well, Kalinin was head of the Supreme Soviet from 1938 until 1946. He had little actual political power, but for a term of 19 years, he was called the head of state. In fact, the longest sitting head of state of Russia up until Vladimir Putin. The building you see here is the Verkhno-Uralsk Isolator. At least that's what Solzhenitsyn refers to it in the book. This is the prison. If you remember that group of prisoners who were on the Sovietsky Islands, they were protesting having their outside time taken away, and eventually they annoyed the Soviets enough that they got transferred to this place. This is the place where they sent them. And the leaders were separated from the wider group along the way. Well, this prison was specially built for political dissidents. So we have Mensheviks, Trotskyists, other leftist anarchists who did not align with the Bolshevik way of thinking. This prison was for them, and its time of notoriety was in the 1930s. And even despite the harsh crackdowns on the prisoners' ability to communicate with one another, they still managed to produce political writings, including a journal known as the Bolshevik Leninist. And even as recently as 2018, new writings from this prison are still being found. This is Alexander Nogtov, born in 1892. He spent his young adulthood in the Russian merchant fleet. After the October Revolution, he became a good communist. He served the Soviet Union on the ways for a few years. In 1921, he joined the Cheka. In 1923, he was appointed head of the Solovki Special Purpose Camp. So in the beginning of Chapter 12, when Solzhenitsyn talks about the prisoners on the Solovetsky Islands protesting to have their outside time given back, Solzhenitsyn heavily mentions this guy's successor, Eichmann's, but he actually omits mention of Nogtov himself. Now, Nogtov was known as a pretty harsh and arbitrary prison administrator, known for personally executing prisoners, known for drunkenness, known for inspecting the women's barracks. This is the guy responsible for the killing of the 6 prisoners out in the prison yard in 1923, and Eichmanns would not take over the position until another 2 years after that.